A German night fighter radar controller at a ground station near Hamburg in July 1943, watching his radar screen suddenly fill with impossible numbers of targets as the first large-scale window raid begins. It is just after midnight, 24th of July, 1943. North of Hamburg, inside a concrete bunker, a young Luftwaffe radar operator named Karl rubs his eyes and leans closer to the glowing circle in front of him. For hours, the Würzburg set has been behaving exactly as the manuals promised. One bright blip for each intruder, a clean arc, the bomber stream creeping in from the North Sea, line after line of range and bearing called to the controller behind him. Then, without warning, the picture breaks. The single line of echoes explodes into a storm. The scope flares with specks of light. Hundreds of returns where there should be dozens. But the carefully plotted track turns into a snowstorm of ghosts. Karl adjusts the gain. Nothing. He narrows the beam, shifts the antenna. Still the same. A boiling cloud of echoes. No way to tell a Lancaster from clutter. Over the intercom, the controller demands a course for the night fighter circling above the city. Karl hesitates. There's nothing to give him but chaos. Outside, searchlights hunt empty sky. Somewhere in the dark, the real bombers are coming. Karl stares at the radar and whispers a question nobody in the bunker can yet answer. What did the British just drop into the sky that made his radar go blind? This is the story of that invisible weapon. How British scientists and RAF Bomber Command turned strips of aluminium foil into a shield of radio echoes, and how, for a few crucial months over Hamburg, the Ruhr, and Berlin, yet it rewrote the night war between bombers and German radar. It's also the story of the men on both sides of the scopes and guns, suddenly fighting not just with machines and explosives, but with the physics of radio waves and the psychology of uncertainty. To understand why window was worth the risk, you have to start with a brutal arithmetic. By early 1943, the RAF's night bomber offensive was both massive and precarious. In the Battle of the Ruhr alone, Bomber Command sent roughly 18,500 sorties against Germany's industrial heartland and lost around 870 aircraft, about 4.7% of the attacking force on average, with total casualties including damaged aircraft reaching a grim 16% of sorties. Translated into crew survival, that meant something ugly. If each raid cost 5 or 6 bombers out of every 100, thus a crew trying to complete a tour of 30 operations was gambling against the house every single night. The main killer was no longer flak alone, but an organized system, the Kammhuber Line. From Denmark down through France, Germany had built overlapping boxes of radar and searchlights. Freya sets sweeping for incoming bombers, Würzburg tracking radars locking onto individual targets, and controllers vectoring twin-engine night fighters into position. By 1942 to 43, hundreds of German night fighters, many fitted with their own airborne Liechtenstein radar, were operating in this system. RAF estimates suggested that around 2/3 of their night losses were now due to these fighters homing in on radar data. The British answer up to that point had been better navigation, OBO-G, new ground mapping radar like H2S, and the 4-engined heavy bombers, Lancasters and Halifaxes, that could carry ever larger loads. But the defensive wall was stiffening faster than the offensive could grow. If loss rates kept creeping up, the bomber campaign itself was at risk of becoming unsustainable. A way was needed not just to fly harder through the fire, but to reach into the German radar picture and smear it beyond recognition. That was the strategic problem Windows set out to solve. Not to shoot down a single aircraft or silence a single gun, but to break the nervous system of the entire night defense, at least long enough for the bombers to get through. At the heart of Window is a wonderfully simple piece of physics: resonance. A radar works by sending out pulses of radio energy and listening for the faint reflections that bounce off metal surfaces. So the size of that reflected signal depends not only on how big the object is, but also on how its shape and dimensions interact with the radar's wavelength. Think of a guitar string. Pluck it, and the string vibrates strongest at certain lengths and tensions, the resonant frequencies. Or imagine pushing someone on a swing. If you time your pushes just right, the motion grows dramatically with very little effort. A strip of metal in a radar beam behaves like a tiny radio swing. If the strip's length is close to half the wavelength of the radar, electrical currents induced along it reinforce each other, and the strip re-radiates an especially strong echo back to the radar. In technical terms, it looks like a half-wave dipole antenna tuned to that radar. German Würzburg tracking radars, the backbone of their night fighter control, operated in the low UHF band around 560 MHz, which corresponds to a wavelength of roughly 50 to 60 centimeters. British scientists, after examining captured Würzburg equipment from the Bruneval raid in February 1942, realized something crucial. Most German radars clustered into only a few frequency bands. If you cut strips of aluminium foil to about half the wavelength, somewhere around 25 to 30 centimeters for Würzburg, and dropped thousands of them into the air, each strip would act like a fake aircraft as far as that radar was concerned. One bomber carrying bundles of these tuned strips could, on radar, imitate a swarm. Even better, as the foil fluttered and tumbled through the air, those echoes would move and spread, creating drifting clouds of false targets. From the radar operator's viewpoint, the clean line of blips marking the bomber stream would be replaced by a dense, shimmering fog of returns. The precise plots needed to guide a night fighter onto one particular Lancaster would disappear inside a storm of ghosts. Nothing about this destroyed the radar sets themselves or jammed their electronics in the active sense. Instead, window weaponized clutter. It flooded the enemy's picture with so much believable nonsense that the real signal was buried inside it. Turning that elegant idea into something aircrews could actually use happened in a very British mixture of improvisation and bureaucracy. The core work fell to the Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, the radar research center that had already helped create much of Britain's early warning and navigation technology. Under A.P. Rowe, with scientists like R.V. Jones and physicist Joan Curran, the team experimented with different materials and dimensions. Plain foil, metallized paper, and various lengths and widths, dropped from aircraft and measured against test radars. They learned that narrow strips of aluminized paper, tuned to half a wavelength, were both effective and lightweight. You could pack huge numbers into bundles that fit through a bomber's flare chute. Tests suggested that a full load from one aircraft could generate a radar signature equivalent to hundreds of bombers. By early 1942, the concept was essentially ready. It even had a code name, Window, chosen by Rowe, and a German counterpart in development under the name Duppel, after an estate where German engineers tested similar foil. Then the project hit the brakes. Well, Britain's leading scientific advisor, Frederick Lindemann, and others in Fighter Command and Anti-Aircraft Command were terrified that if the RAF used Window over Germany, the Luftwaffe would immediately copy it and throw it back over Britain. The radar chains defending British cities still operated at wavelengths that could, in principle, be blinded the same way. If the Germans responded with their own chaff during a renewed blitz, the fear was that British radar defenses might collapse. So Window sat on the shelf. For more than a year, while bomber command crews died over the Ruhr, the packets of foil stayed in storage, their potential carefully documented and carefully unused. By mid-1943, however, the loss rates and the growing scale of the bomber offensive pushed the argument the other way. Bomber Command had more advanced centimetric radars coming into service that would be less vulnerable to simple foil strips, and the strategic need to break German night defenses was becoming urgent. Arthur "Bomber" Harris, head of Bomber Command, finally won permission to use Window as part of a new offensive, the destruction of Hamburg, Operation Gomorrah. The first crews to use Window belonged to units like 76 Squadron. Their briefing for the night of 24th to 25th July 1943 included an unusual extra task. Alongside fuel, bombs, and route maps, each aircraft carried bundles of neatly wrapped packets, metallized paper strips cut to the right length, packed into 1-pound bundles. The instructions were simple and almost absurdly manual. Over the North Sea as the bomber stream approached the German coast, but a crewman would stand at the flare chute with a stopwatch. Every minute, on the tick, he would shove a bundle out into the slipstream, then get the next one ready. And the next, and the next. As the first wave of Lancasters and Halifaxes crossed the coastline that night, those bundles burst open in the wind. Tens of thousands of strips fanned out and hung in the air, each one tumbling and scattering radar energy in all directions. On the scopes around Hamburg, the bomber's stream dissolved into the chaos Carl saw in our opening scene. The result was devastating for the defenders. In that opening raid of Operation Gomorrah, around 791 British aircraft set out. 728 bombed Hamburg, and only 12 were lost, about 1.5% of the force, far below the usual 5% loss rate Bomber Command considered barely acceptable. These searchlights swept aimlessly. Night fighters, deprived of precise vectoring from their controllers, found far fewer bombers than expected. And over the city, the bombing was concentrated enough to help kindle one of the first great firestorms of the war, killing tens of thousands and gutting vast areas of Hamburg's industrial and residential districts. Window had done exactly what it was designed to do, not to save every bomber, but to slice the edge off the German defenses at the moment of contact, tipping the odds back toward the attackers. The British were quick to capitalize on the shock. Within days of Hamburg, Window was being used on other major targets. On the night of 25th to 26 July 1943, Bomber Command turned back to Essen, home of the Krupp Armament Works. In 1942, while raids on Essen had cost around 10% of attacking aircraft, now, with Window in use and other techniques refined, roughly 705 bombers attacked for the loss of 26, about 3.7%. The Krupp Works suffered some of its worst damage of the war. For crews, the emotional impact was as big as the statistics. Veteran airmen who had grown used to seeing bomber after bomber, picked off by radar-directed fighters, suddenly flew through nights where the sky felt strangely empty of enemy aircraft. They could see the firestorm below and the occasional decoy rockets, but the black shapes of night fighters seemed fewer, the sudden streaks of tracer rarer. They still died. Engines failed. Flak shells found their mark. Collisions in the crowded bomber stream still happened. But something fundamental had shifted. The German air defense system, most meticulously built for years, was no longer a well-oiled machine. It was groping in the dark. If you enjoy this kind of deep dive into the strange science behind wartime decisions, feel free to subscribe. It's one of the easiest ways to tell me to make more of them. Of course, technology never sits still in a war. If Window had frozen the German system permanently, the story would be simple. Instead, it kicked off a new phase, a scrambling search for countermeasures. In the weeks after Hamburg, German commanders realized that the Himmelbett box system, one radar sector controlling one or two fighters against each bomber, no longer worked when the radars saw only clouds of chaff. The solution was to loosen the leash. New tactics like wild sow, wild boar, put single-engine day fighters over target cities, while using searchlights and fires to find bombers visually. Zahm sow, tame boar, used running commentary from control centers to guide radar-equipped fighters into the general vicinity of the bomber stream, then left them to hunt on their own. By the time of the Battle of Berlin, from late 1943 into early 1944, Window was still part of every large raid, but it was no longer a magic shield. Bomber Command flew over 9,000 sorties against Berlin alone, losing nearly 500 aircraft and suffering a loss rate close to 6%, higher than the level they themselves considered sustainable. In other words, Window didn't end the bomber campaign's bloodletting. It bought breathing space, forced the Germans into less efficient tactics. This and opened a window, ironically named, for further electronic warfare measures like airborne jammers aimed at specific radars. Meanwhile, the idea itself spread. The Luftwaffe's own version, Duple, entered operational use in the autumn of 1943, including during the Baby Blitz raids against Britain in early 1944. German bombers scattered their own foil over British territory, hoping to blur RAF radar just as effectively. But they faced a different set of constraints: far smaller bomber formations, a powerful and radar-equipped RAF night fighter force, and British ground radars that were rapidly moving to higher frequencies, less vulnerable to simple strips. A Duple did cause trouble, particularly in some Mediterranean operations such as the Luftwaffe raid on Bari in December 1943, But it never rewrote the night air war over Britain the way Window had over Germany in that critical summer. Other allies adopted the technique as well. The USAAF integrated chaff into its own operations. Naval forces later used rockets and shells to throw chaff clouds in front of ships. By the latter half of the war, vast tonnages of aluminium foil were being produced for this purpose. One estimate suggests that roughly 3/4 of the world's wartime aluminium foil production, around 20,000 tons, ended up as chaff. The legacy of Window goes far beyond World War II. On a technical level, it codified the idea of passive electronic countermeasures. Instead of blasting noise at hostile sensors, you can manipulate what they see by shaping the environment itself. Modern chaff cartridges fired from warships and aircraft are direct descendants, clusters of radar-tuned fibers that burst into volumetric clouds, drawing the gaze of incoming radar-guided missiles away from the real target. Modern fighter jets routinely launch chaff and flares together, the chaff to blind radar seekers, the flares to tempt infrared ones. The physical details have changed, fiberglass and advanced coatings instead of simple foil strips. But the underlying trick is the same one Joan Curran and her colleagues tested in the early 1940s. At a conceptual level, Window helped push air warfare into what we might call the information domain. Once you accept that a bomber stream can hide inside a man-made storm of false echoes, well, it's a short step to more sophisticated deceptions. Decoy drones that mimic radar signatures, cyber attacks that feed false tracks into air defense networks, and modern electronic attacks that blur or overwhelm sensors without ever firing a shot. From satellite decoys to jamming pods on strike aircraft, much of Cold War and post-Cold War electronic warfare rests on the same basic insight. If you can't kill the enemy's eyes, you can still drown them in illusions. Let's return to Karl in his bunker north of Hamburg. Months have passed since that first night. The controllers talk now of new tactics, fighters sent up in swarms, hunting by the light of burning cities, others guided not by clean radar plots, but by broad, running commentaries from higher headquarters. The elegance of the old Himmelbett system is gone, as the sky feels wilder, less predictable. Karl has learned, in broad strokes, what happened that July night. Intelligence and technical officers have briefed the crews. The British dropped aluminium strips tuned to Würzburg's wavelength. The bright fog on the screen wasn't a malfunction, but a man-made storm of echoes. There is even talk that Germany had invented something similar first and held it back for the same reasons the British did, fear of what would happen if the other side copied it. Sometimes, on quiet shifts, he thinks about the invisible stuff drifting down through the dark. Each strip thinner than a matchstick, lighter than a feather, yet together forming a kind of armor, not around any one bomber, but around the whole attacking force wrapped in a cloak of reflected radio energy. For the men in the bombers, a Window did not make the war safe. The flak still burst, the fighters still came, and the odds remained harsh. But on nights like Hamburg, those little strips of foil bent the invisible beams of the German radars just enough to change who lived, who died, and which cities burned. In the end, that is the idea behind Window. Using the laws of physics not to hit harder, but to make the enemy doubt what they see. To turn empty air into a weapon and echoes into a shield.